Well, finally made it. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and dropped the bags to the ground, my eyes fixed on the slightly tilted, moss-covered cabin nestled deep in the lush green forest. Yeah, there's plenty of work to do here. Everything around was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The little fence I'd built last spring had collapsed completely. Probably had a visit from a moose or maybe even a bear. That's fine, I've dealt with worse. This wouldn't be the first time I had to patch things up. At least the front door was still standing. No one had broken in. If something, or someone, had gotten inside, everything I'd spent months building would have been for nothing. Thank God the lock was untouched. That means nobody has found it yet. I turned the key and the door creaked open, releasing a wave of damp wood and cold forest air into my face. The scent was oddly comforting. Inside, everything was where I'd left it, except for a thick layer of dust now covering the wooden dishes on the shelves, and the shelves themselves. This little cabin, hidden deep within the forest, I built it about 2 years ago. Why, you may ask? Because I'm a forest ranger, and once a year, every summer, I come out here for a few months, kind of like a personal retreat, a break from the familiar rhythm of family life back home. It's peaceful out here, beautiful, quiet, exactly what I need. If it were up to me, I'd live out here all year, but that's just not realistic. Winters in this part of the country are cold and heavy with snow, and I doubt I could make it through without proper heating. This place is far removed from civilization, and that's exactly how I want it. I don't need uninvited guests showing up with their barbecue gear, blasting music, drinking, and yelling into the trees. Out here, nature still feels untouched, raw and quiet. You won't even find proper trails. Everything is dense and wild. I guess I'm the only one who's dared to disturb the peace by building this little cabin. But I don't just sit around while I'm here. Since my last visit, everything has become overgrown again. Some of the wood's gone soft with moisture, and even the fence was knocked over by something large. But I probably already mentioned that. I don't bring much food with me, just the basics. Some spices, half a sack of potatoes, bread to last the first few days, and a few odds and ends. Most of what I eat I get from the forest itself. There's a crystal clear pond not far from here, full of fish. I can usually set a few traps for rabbits. It's enough. I also mount trail cameras on the trees from time to time. It's always fascinating to see who, or what, passes through at night. And frankly, I'd like to know what keeps knocking my fence down. It's twice now. The trail cams often catch the local wildlife, everything from small critters to the bigger residents of the forest. I remember one time a big brown bear got curious and wouldn't leave the camera alone, like it was smeared with honey or something. I thought he'd rip the whole thing off the tree and drag it back to his den, but thankfully he didn't. Though I did have to patch the camera up afterwards. He'd gnawed on it pretty good. I worked non-stop until evening, clearing brush, chopping firewood, making a trip down to the pond to fetch some water. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was exhausted. I sat down by the fire and started making dinner. I peeled some potatoes, seared a bit of meat. Soon the delicious scent was drifting through the trees. I stirred everything around in the skillet and hoped that I wasn't attracting some night guests. The tops of the old pine trees pierced the starry sky like spears. It was quiet, peaceful, except for the constant chirping of crickets. I sat there, watching it all, eating my stew, letting the silence soak in. Sleep started creeping in before I'd even finished my meal. I'd poured all my energy into the day and my body was ready to collapse. I sat back for a few more minutes beside the fire, then poured water over it to put it out and headed back inside the cabin for the night. Nights in these parts can get surprisingly cold, but I'd accounted for that when building the cabin. In one corner, I'd installed something resembling a fireplace. Not exactly elegant, but more than enough to warm the place throughout the night. By the time I was turned in, the walls were radiating a gentle, steady heat, and the air inside was thick with the scent of wood and ash. Gosh, it's cozy in here, I thought as I lay down on the makeshift bed. Just a pile of straw-stuffed sacks, but to me, it was better than any mattress. No springs creaking under you, No synthetic smells, just silence and the soft rustle of dry straw. I barely had time to close my eyes before the sleep took me like a wave. I slept deeply, without dreams, until just before dawn. Something stirred me from that peaceful state. At first it was just a faint sound, rustling leaves, but not random or gentle. There was a deliberate persistence to it, like someone was standing just beyond the wall, rocking a branch back and forth as if to make sure I had heard it. I opened my eyes, half expecting it to be the wind. Sitting up, I glanced towards the window. The first signs of morning were beginning to reveal themselves, a soft gray light brushing the tops of the trees, but the forest outside was utterly still. The tall pines stood motionless, and the air beyond the glass was frozen in place. No wind, no movement, no logical explanation. And with that realization, I became fully awake. My first assumption, that it had simply been a gust of wind, crumbled almost completely. It had to have been an animal, I reasoned. A hare, maybe, or maybe a boar. But then again, it could just as easily have been a bear, or even a wolf. Neither would be a surprise in these woods. Perhaps the smell of last night's dinner had lingered too long and invited someone in for a closer look. I rose quietly and reached for my rifle, more out of instinct than fear, and then moved towards the door and paused, listening. There was nothing. Not even a whisper, not a shuffle, not even the tension of something holding its breath. After another moment, I eased the door open and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Everything appeared to be undisturbed. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no visible signs that anything had passed by during the night. It was strange enough to make me hesitate, but not alarming enough to dwell on. Maybe I had dreamed it after all. Still, as I scratched the back of my head and stepped back inside, I made a mental note to set out a few trail cams later in the day. Nothing complicated, just enough to see what might be wandering around at night. It seemed like a harmless idea at the time, even a bit of idle curiosity, though I would later come to wish I had left the forest to its quiet. But that, of course, would come later. For now the night was giving way to morning, and the forest, as always, was beginning to stir. Since I was already awake, I figured there was no point in trying to go back to sleep. I walked down to the pond, washed my face, straightened myself up a little bit, and had breakfast. Breakfast was just the leftovers from last night's meal. After that, I got to work. The roof had started leaking a little after the last rain, and it needed patching. That kept me busy for most of the day, up until the evening, when I finally remembered the trail cams. I only had 4 of them. Technically that was enough, but there was far more spots around the area that seemed worth watching. I wanted to cover as much as I could, to catch every little detail that might wander past the cabin. I set the trail cams up around the perimeter and settled in to wait. I brought my laptop with me, oddly enough. Surprisingly, even out this far, I could still get a decent cell signal. With my phone set up as a hotspot, I could stream a movie once in a while or check in on the world through social media. The only real inconvenience was charging the damn battery. I'd have to walk all the way back to the car, and that was a pretty good 300 meters away, if not more. The first few days passed without incident. There was plenty of work to keep me occupied, fishing, gathering berries, taking care of little things around the cabin. This place had no shortage of wild fruit, and I made the most of it. And of course I checked the trail cams daily. They were always full of activity. Foxes, hares, wild boars, all sorts of birds, vibrant, colorful, alive. But there was something else too, something I didn't notice until last night. A thunderstorm rolled in by evening, and as soon as the first drops hit the treetops, I took shelter in the cabin. Bad weather always made the place feel cozier. I sat at my laptop, listening to the drumming of the rain on the roof, and figured I might as well check the trail cams while I waited it out. I popped in the flash drive and started going through the new photos. At first it was the usual. A fox nosing around the edge of the clearing, a pair of hares darting through the underbrush, a wild boar sniffing at one of the trees. But then the next photo loaded, and something felt off. It showed a deer, or at least it looked like one at first glance. It was standing unusually close to the camera, too close for comfort. there was something strange about it. The body, the antlers, they were definitely deer-like, but the head, it looked human. I couldn't quite make sense of what I was seeing. Not exactly, but close enough to make my skin crawl. Or maybe it was just the angle. Maybe the deer had moved its head mid-frame, and the blur was creating something unnatural. I stared at it for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of movement. A distorted image. What a creepy looking thing, huh? I said out loud, as if that might break the tension. Maybe the camera had glitched. It wasn't exactly the most reliable gear after all, and the rain might have interfered. That had to be it. But if the weather had messed with the sensor, why did the rest of the pictures come out crystal clear? It didn't make sense, but I didn't dwell on it. I shrugged it off and kept scrolling through the photos and the video clips, never imagining how much that single image would come to haunt me in the nights ahead. The next morning, I reset the trail cams in the same spots as before. Today was a rest day. I spent most of it lying on the bed, watching movies and doing little else. I only got up to grab a snack or step outside for a smoke. It was one of those slow, quiet days that seemed to dissolve into themselves. By the time I finally stirred again, I realized night had already fallen. I stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and leaned against the doorframe. Darkness that evening was unusually deep. There were no stars visible in the sky at all, as if the forest had pulled a curtain over the world. You might ask, wasn't it frightening, living alone in the middle of the woods, surrounded by pitch-black silence, miles from the nearest person? And I'd say, no, not really. Over the years I've worked as a forest ranger. I've learned more than most people ever will about being alone in wild places. The only real danger here comes from wild animals, wolves, bears, but I know their routes, I know their behavior, and this cabin is far from the places that they usually roam. That said, every once in a while, though rare, one of them does stray closer than usual. For those cases, there's a rifle hanging on the wall beside my bed. It helps me sleep easier knowing it's there. Not just out here, but in general. All the times I've come out here, all the summers I've spent alone in this place, nothing ever happened. Not even once. But I guess this time was different. A couple of days later, while going through another batch of trail cam footage, I noticed something else. The moment I saw it, a chill ran down my spine, and my palms began to sweat. I won't claim anything with certainty. The image quality was far from perfect. But behind one of the trees, it looked like something was there. At first I assumed it was just a wild boar or something similar to that, but the longer I stared, the less sense that made. The shape was too thin, too tall. It wasn't the kind of bulk you'd expect from a boar. The silhouette didn't match any animal I knew, and the eyes, two bright, glowing spots in the middle of the forest gloom, almost perfectly round. That more than anything told me I wasn't imagining it. Whatever it was alive. The photo had come from a different camera this time, one I'd mounted just a few dozen meters from the cabin's front door. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just some trick of the light. Who knows what really moves through the forest at night? Not long ago, I thought I saw a deer with a human face, and now this. Well, maybe these old cameras were finally on their last legs. That's what I told myself. I closed the laptop as its battery had nearly been drained and stretched out on the straw-filled bedding. That night, my sleep was restless. The rain had returned, harder than before, and the wind had picked up to the point that I found myself muttering silent prayers, hoping nothing would come crashing down on my fragile little cabin. Eventually, after what felt like half an hour or so, I drifted off. But that night marked the beginning of something else. Something strange, impossible to explain. I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps sloshing through mud, right outside the cabin. The ground had been soaked through earlier by the storm. Puddles and wet earth were everywhere. Even half asleep, I could clearly hear someone moving quickly through it all, running. I immediately reached for the shotgun. The rain, thankfully, had almost fully stopped. Only a faint rumble echoed in the distance, and the wind occasionally whispered past the window. but it was quiet enough that I could hear the footsteps clearly, first coming from the direction of the broken fence, and then moving toward the side of the cabin where I had mounted the first trail cam. The sound shifted closer, then farther, then close again, circling. Let me say this again. For all those years I've worked as a forest ranger, I've learned a great deal, especially how animals move through the wild. And whatever was out there, it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever encountered. That was when the unease settled deep into my bones. I lay still on the bed of straw, clutching the old single-barrel shotgun, barely daring to breathe. And strangely, the weapon didn't offer much comfort, not tonight. After maybe 3 minutes, the footsteps stopped. I thought about sitting up, maybe peeking through the window, but then came the knock. Solid, deliberate knock at the front door. I froze. My hands went limp for a moment, and I nearly dropped the gun. It was around 3 in the morning. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, let alone a person. No one came out here. No one but me. And yet, someone had knocked. Not a branch falling, not an animal brushing past. This was a distinct knock, like a fist tapping on wood. I tried to think logically. Maybe, just maybe, it was a lost traveler. Like a fisherman, a hunter, someone. People get turned around in the woods sometimes. It was possible. And the smoke from my chimney, maybe someone could have seen it from a distance, been drawn to it. Having come to that conclusion, I couldn't think of anything better than simply asking who was at the door. "Who's there?" I called out, drawing a full breath into my chest to steady myself. Silence. Another cold wave ran down my spine. I waited a moment and asked again, a little louder this time. Still no response. But then I heard the footsteps again, this time retreating, moving away from the cabin. A slow, deliberate rhythm fading into the night. Within a minute, they had vanished completely. No more knocking, no more movement outside. I didn't dare open the door and check outside, not until morning. No more movement outside. And sleep, that was out of the question. I lay awake, eyes wide in the dark, listening for anything, any sound that might return. But none came. Eventually, sunlight reached through the cracks of the shutters, casting faint golden lines across the floor. And only then did I allow myself to get out. The first thing I noticed when I stepped outside were the tracks. The entire clearing was trampled. Bare footprints. Human. But they were strange, elongated somehow. The toes were oddly long and crooked, bent in unnatural directions, uneven from foot to foot. It wasn't just unsettling, it was impossible. I stood there, studying the shapes pressed into the mud, trying to make sense of who or what had been there. The truth is, when the sun is shining bright, the birds are singing, and a warm breeze rustles through the trees, the terror and the unease of the night before started to feel distant, almost like a half-remembered dream. That morning, I didn't want to remember anything. I pushed it from my thoughts, but the memory came rushing back that evening. I'd gone to the car to charge my phone and the laptop, just like always. It was already getting dark, and I left the fire burning near the cabin so I wouldn't lose my way. I reached the car, took the key, and turned the ignition. Nothing. Not a sound, not even a click. Frowning, I tried again. Same result. Puzzled, I stepped out and popped the hood, and immediately stumbled backward. Everything inside had been torn apart. Every wire, every hose, every piece that could be ripped, sliced, or severed had been ruined, shredded beyond recognition. It was like someone had taken a handful of claws and gutted the engine like a carcass. And that was when everything clicked. The photos, the footsteps, the knock in the middle of the night. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding, boots slipping in the mud. On the way, I grabbed all the trail cams I could reach. Once inside, I managed to power up the laptop, barely. By some miracle, it still had about 10% battery left. My hands were trembling as I slid the flash drive into the port and opened the files. This time, I went straight for the video from the camera positioned closest to the cabin, and what I saw, I still struggle to describe it. Those footsteps from the other night, now I knew what they belonged to. The motion-triggered camera had captured something I couldn't explain, something that filled me with a kind of fear I hadn't felt since I was a child. It was just standing there behind a tree, trying, perhaps, to stay out of view, but it had been caught anyway. The creature stood on two unnaturally thin legs, its posture awkward, almost human, but not quite. Because the footage was black and white, I couldn't tell what color it really was. On the screen it appeared pale, almost as white as paper. Its eyes glowed with an eerie brightness, most likely just because the camera's infrared. But that wasn't what unnerved me. It was the silhouette, far taller than any man. It barely fit in the frame. From its body jutted several strange appendages, almost like branches or splintered limbs, protruding from its back and sides. Its head was bald, elongated, and its face was smeared with something dark. Mud, maybe. Or something worse. I couldn't tell. Where the nose should have been, there was only a dark void, an empty cavity, and just below it, another wider hollow stretched across the face. A mouth, I assumed, or something like one. It was moving constantly, opening and closing in slow, deliberate motions, as if the thing were speaking. And just as the screen began to dim, the battery almost gone, I noticed something else. It wasn't alone. I don't know how I missed it in the video before. Maybe I was too focused on the first one, but they were there. Similar silhouette, but each one had its own subtle difference. Some variation in posture, in shape, in the way they moved. And just as I saw it, the laptop screen went black. The battery finally had given out, and with it, the only light I had. The forest outside was again swallowed by darkness. Not a single star above. I knew I had to get through the night. Come morning, I'd start walking, find the nearest town no matter how far. An inexplicable anxiety was growing within me. That's why I kept the shotgun clutched close, my finger never far from the trigger. I even opened a fresh box of shells and stuffed the rounds into every pocket I had, just in case. There was no way I could sleep after what I'd seen. But my body had other plans. It hadn't rested properly the night before, and despite everything, the exhaustion caught up with me. Sometime around 1 a.m, I dozed off, still fully clothed, boots on, cradling the gun against my chest, lying on the straw sacks like a soldier in a trench. I don't know how long I was out, but something woke me. A violent crash against the door, so loud it lifted me from the bed. My heart shot into my throat. Before I could fully understand what was happening, another impact followed. I forgot to mention, before turning in, I'd wedged 2 thick logs against the door as a makeshift brace. But now, with each blow, the entire cabin seemed to shudder, and I knew they wouldn't hold for long. The fear was so intense I could feel it crawling into my limbs. After the 3rd blow, there was silence, but only for a second. Instead, a flurry of rapid footsteps erupted around the cabin, clear, distinct, and far too many to count. I was afraid to imagine how many of them were out there. I just sat there on the straw bed, frozen in place, unable to move. And then, one of them leaned in close to the window. Staring back at me was the same face, if it could even be called that I had seen in the trail cam footage. But what I remembered most were its fingers. They looked just like the gnarled branches of a tree. Suddenly, it began sliding its hand across the glass, slowly, deliberately, and the pane started to crack under the pressure. That was when I snapped out of it. I raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening, so loud it left my ears ringing instantly. The The last thing I heard was a guttural scream and the sharp shatter of breaking glass. I quickly ejected the shell, loading another round, and listened. It seemed like those bastards had scattered. I couldn't hear any more footsteps. Maybe it was just the ringing in my ears, I thought. But no. Everything had gone silent. Even the crickets had stopped. Then, just a moment later, it was as if something had snapped. The footsteps returned, rapid, frenzied, and now they came from not just around the cabin, but above, on the roof, even along the walls, like those bastards were crawling around like goddamn Spider-Men. I kept my eyes locked on the shattered window. One of them had darted past it. I don't know how it was clinging to the wall, but it was. Then they started pounding on the door with wild, relentless force. My hands shaking, I raised the shotgun and fired at head height. Then I reloaded and shot again, this time lower. That's when I saw it. A face I already knew too well. Glowing eyes. A single black void where the nose and mouth should have been. It peeked through the hole I had just blown open in the door. Turns out my shooting had made things easier for it. It reached a limb through the opening, fumbling for the latch. Realizing what it was doing, I reloaded and fired again, this time right at the hand. A splash of blackish green liquid hit the doorframe, and the arm snapped back immediately. After that last shot, everything went silent again. I stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, clutching the shotgun with trembling hands. My mouth was dry, my ears were ringing. The air was thick with the sharp scent of gunpowder, but this time, the silence lasted a bit longer than before. After what felt like 10 minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to peer through the broken window. There was nothing outside. Or was there? Maybe they were hiding, just waiting for me to leave my shelter. They were smart, too smart. They understood things. God, what were they? What did they want from me? I sat down on the bed and buried my head in my hands. I tried turning on my phone, but of course it was dead. Battery gone. So I just sat there, waiting for the first rays of sunlight to break through the shattered glass. Dawn came agonizingly slowly, but the primal fear from the night before didn't go anywhere. Only when it was fully light, when birdsong returned to the trees, did I finally step outside. The first thing I saw were the streaks of black-green slime smeared along the wall beneath the window. The door, still splintered and battered, was covered in the same foul substance. I wasn't about to tempt fate any further. I packed what I could carry and started walking toward the highway. Fortunately, I knew the area well. I'd walked it dozens of times. I knew the trail like the back of my hand. But here's the thing. I kept walking. An hour passed, then 2. I should have reached the road long ago, but the forest just wouldn't end. It was as if the trees had grown around me, stretching the path further and farther away. Panic began to set in. Exhausted, sleep-deprived, and starving, I kept walking, only to realize I no longer had any idea where I was. Dusk was settling in, and with it came the terrible thought that those things might show up again, only this time there would be nowhere to hide. I couldn't take it anymore. I gave up. I slumped down beside the nearest tree and just simply waited for whatever was coming. But it seemed luck was on my side, at least this one time. Through the darkness that had fallen over the forest, I saw it. A faint glow, the reflection of light off roadside guardrails. My heart surged. With the last bit of strength I had, I forced myself up and ran toward that light. Behind me I could hear branches cracking, like something moving, snapping them underfoot. But I didn't care anymore. I already broke through the last line of trees and stumbled out onto the road. It took a while to flag someone down, but eventually, a young man pulled over and let me in. I was still catching my breath, trying to process everything, when he said something that froze me in place. I asked him if he could give me a lift back to my town, but he just looked at me like I was out of my mind. "I'm not going that far," he said. "That's basically a different state." I stared at him. A different state? "What do you mean?" "I'm not driving all the way up there," he said. "That's the Upper Peninsula. Might as well be another state. Are you sure you're alright, man?" Apparently, I wasn't. "Okay, then I'd be grateful if you could at least drop me at the bus station." "Yeah, that works. It's on the way." From there, I finally made it back home. A couple of days later, I came back with a friend to retrieve my car. But what we found near the cabin barely resembled a vehicle. It was almost entirely rotted out, overgrown with moss and vines. Nothing more than a rusted husk. There was no point trying to tow it back, and the cabin itself, I barely recognized it. Crooked, collapsing, covered in strange root-like growths. None of my belongings were inside. We left without a word. The whole ride back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. The memories of that night still circling in my head. I don't know what that was. I won't even try to explain it. But one thing I know for certain. The trail cams, the rustling outside, the footsteps. They were signs, warnings. I should have taken them seriously. I should have left sooner. I brushed it all off, blamed the wind, poor camera quality, my own fatigue. And by the time I realized what I'd invited myself into, it was too late. The thing, whatever it was, had made my cabin its home. I was the intruder, not them. And when I ran, they twisted the woods behind me, confused my sense of direction, sent me stumbling out into an entirely different region. I wasn't supposed to find the road, but I did. And I'm sure of one thing now. They didn't want me to.